Hi, and welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. This week, our subjects are Joan and Margaret Holland. It's another sister episode, guys, and I'm so excited. So here we go. Joan Holland was born in 1380 in England, the sixth of 10 children, born to Thomas Holland and his wife, Joan Fitzalland. Margaret was the eighth of 10 children to the same couple. She was 5 years younger than her sister Joan. Their father was the oldest son and heir to Joan, the Fair Maid of Kent, and her first secret husband, Thomas Holland. Joan of Kent was a countess in her own right, so he would have grown up in a mid-level noble's household. His father died when Thomas was just 10 years old, and he became the Baron Holland. The following year, his mother married Edward the Black Prince, the heir to the throne of England. Her mother, Alice Fitzalland, was the fourth of 7 children. Her father was an earl, so she also would have grown up in a mid-level noble household. When Alice was 4, she was betrothed to her father's ward, Edmund Mortimer, Earl of March. But as was the case with many early betrothals in the 14th century, it never materialized. Instead, Alice married Thomas Holland, also an earl. So technically a lateral move from her first betrothal, except for one thing. Thomas Holland was the older half-brother of the future King of England, Richard. Eventually, Thomas's little brother Richard would become King Richard II, and sooner rather than later, because Richard had a sickly father and an elderly grandfather. Alice's father would have likely seen this as more security for his daughter. He wasn't a royal duke because he wasn't the king's full brother, but he was an earl and the future king's favorite older brother. The couple married when they were both 14 years old, young, but at least age-appropriate for each other. At 16, Joan's father was put in charge of the armed forces in Aquitaine, of whom his stepfather was duke, so nepotism for sure. At 20, the couple started their family, having a daughter, Eleanor, in 1370, followed by Thomas in 72, John in 74, Richard in 76, Elizabeth in 78, and Joan in 80. Joan Holland, our subject for this week, or at least half of it. You don't have to remember all of her siblings, but her parents were averaging a baby about every 2 years. Joan also had 4 younger siblings, Edmund in 84, Margaret in 85, our other subject for this week, Eleanor in 86, and Bridget. We don't know when Bridget was born, but an educated guess would be 1388. She was the 10th child and 6th girl, so not much was written down. All we know about Bridget is that she was a nun and had probably been one since she was a child. In the Middle Ages, often in large families, they would dedicate their youngest daughters to God. The reasoning was threefold. First, as a gift to God for blessing you with so many children. Secondly, free education. Nuns were taught Latin so that they could read the Bible. Outside of clergy, most people could not read Latin. Thirdly, it was costly to come up with 6 dowries, especially for an earl. He was a mid-level noble, and his 6 daughters would be expected to marry either a noble or God, and God didn't require a dowry. Noblemen were expensive to marry. So Bridget, probably the youngest, definitely a nun, #justice for Bridget the Forgotten. Sometime around Bridget's birth, dowries would have been on her parents' mind. Her older sister, Eleanor, was 18 and already late for marriage. But her father Thomas had a plan. He was going to marry his 18-year-old oldest daughter to his 13-year-old ward, Roger Mortimer. I don't know what her dowry was, but I assume they got the friends and family discount because her future husband lived with her father. Coincidentally, or maybe not so coincidentally, Roger was the son of Edmund Mortimer, the same Edmund Mortimer that her mother had been betrothed to. Sort of like, look, we didn't work out, but how about if my kid marries your kid? One daughter down, married to a future earl, who was projected to earn about £4,000 a year, which was very respectable for that time. They started a family right away, having a baby 2 months after their wedding. So I guess they started before right away. And because of the timing, the baby may not have even been the 13-year-old groom's. But there weren't many paternity tests back then, and he was claimed by his father, and that was all it took to be considered legitimate. This could have been a legal way around a politically sticky situation. Again, I hate the age difference, but they both would have been considered young adults at the time. Joan Holland would have been about 8 when her older sister Eleanor married, and her younger baby sister Bridget was born. Just 3 years later, the Earl probably made his money back when his son and heir was married to the daughter of another Earl, Joan Stafford. I'm guessing Elizabeth was older than her sister Joan. She may have been younger. A lot of people do think she was younger. I'm making my best educated guess. But Joan was the next daughter to be married, and that was unusual if Elizabeth was older. So that might not be the case. Noble marriages were not much more than legal alliances between the couple and their parents. Generally, unless there were extenuating circumstances, sisters would be married off oldest to youngest. At the age of 13, Joan was married to a royal duke, Edmund, Duke of York. Edmund was the son to the late King Edward III, and uncle to the current King Richard II. If you remember, Richard was the youngest half-brother to Joan and Margaret's father, meaning Joan married her uncle King Richard's uncle, Duke Edmund. She married her uncle's uncle, and he was 52. Ew. She was 13. Even if you account for age inflation of the time, Joan was barely old enough to get married. It would be seen now like if an 18 or 19-year-old girl married a man in his mid to late 70s. And unlike today, the bride probably would have had very little input into who her husband was. The 52-year-old Edmund had been married once before. We actually talked about him in the Constance and Isabella of Castile episode. His first wife was Isabella of Castile, the unhappy marriage where Isabella had a boyfriend. Isabella's boyfriend had been Joan's one-time bad boy uncle, philanderer, and convicted murderer extraordinaire, pardoned by his half-brother King Richard. So Edmund said, "Okay, you slept with my wife. I'm going to marry your niece." Again, ew. Before she died, Constance and Edmund had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. The 13-year-old bride, Joan, was now the stepmother to 20-year-old Edward, 18-year-old Constance, who, I feel like I need to tell you, wasn't married herself, even though her father was marrying a 13-year-old. And 8-year-old Richard, who had been seen more like a peer to her than a stepson. Her youngest stepson was older than some of her little sisters. And, if the rumors were true, he was the son of his mother's boyfriend, Joan's bad boy uncle, making her stepson potentially her cousin. But officially, legally, and what everyone agreed to, was that he was her stepson. The following year, her sister Elizabeth, maybe older, maybe younger, we're never going to know, got married. Unlike her sister, she did not marry a royal duke. She was the wife of an earl. Well, a future earl, eventually, after his father died. So that was probably a discount dowry, too. But what's an earl with 6 daughters to do? He needed to marry off some of his sons to get the money flowing inward instead of outward. But for now, the at most 16-year-old Elizabeth was marrying the 7-year-old son of an earl. They had their first baby 12 years later when they were 28 and 19. The same year that Elizabeth married, her older brother died before he was able to get married. He was 20 and had no children. So the next brother, Richard, was up to earn a dowry for his father. But he also died just 2 years later. Also just 20. Also unmarried and without children. John's father was running out of sons. But he still had his heir, Thomas, now 24, married, but still without children, and his youngest boy, Edmund, still only 12. If he were a girl, he'd probably have been married by now. The following year, Joan's younger sister Margaret was married, and another dowry was paid. She was only 12, and her husband was 24, so sad face. They had their first child 4 years later. Their granddaughter was Margaret Beaufort, the grandmother of the Tudor dynasty. The same year, Margaret married. Their father died, leaving the children, who were still unmarried, in a much lower position than they had been. 14-year-old Edmund was no longer the second surviving son of an earl. He was still his brother's heir presumptive. An heir presumptive is different from an heir in that you are the heir, presuming nothing changes. If his brother never had children, he would be the heir. But just the heir presumptive, because that's presuming nothing changes. If something changes, he is no longer the heir. In addition to Edmund, the new earl had 2 younger sisters, 11-year-old Eleanor, who was named Eleanor, even if you remember that her older sister was named Eleanor. Eleanor and Eleanor. I'm trying to enunciate. The oldest daughter, Eleanor, her name started with an A. The younger daughter, Eleanor, her name started with an E. And probably 10-year-old or younger Bridget, because we don't know how old she was, who may have already begun to learn Latin in training to be a nun. If she had, she would be living at the priory. In any case, by the time her father died, she was probably for sure at the priory by then. And by the ages of her sisters' marriages, Bridget may have dodged a man-sized bullet. Just a year after her father's death, his oldest daughter, Eleanor, with an A, her husband also died, leaving Eleanor a 28-year-old single mother of 5, the sister of an earl and the mother of an earl. Eleanor's husband had been ordered to arrest his uncle, and he had refused. They were now in the time period known as the tyranny of King Richard. I don't think that's what it was called back then. It was named that after, but this was the time period they were in. And it was just as fun as it sounds. Richard was mad. Eleanor's husband had been thought to be the preferred heir of King Richard, who still had no children, and his wife, Queen Isabella, was still a child herself. Eleanor's husband refused to arrest his own uncle. And then he was summoned to Parliament, and he was rapturously received with cheering crowds wearing his colors. My guy was 2009 Justin Bieber. It doesn't seem like Richard would have had a problem with this. Having a popular heir is kind of the dream. #goals. But King Richard had entered his paranoid era, so he saw a popular heir as a threat, and a threat who was refusing to follow his orders. The next year, Roger's brother-in-law was ordered to arrest Roger, and Eleanor's husband Roger was killed in the skirmish, leaving her the 28-year-old single mother of 5, who wasn't sure how safe they were from the angry king. In June of 1399, Joan's younger sister Eleanor was 13 and married to an 11-year-old future earl. They had their first and only daughter 8 years later, when they were 21 and 19 respectively. That same month, Joan and Margaret's older sister Eleanor married for the second time, with her 8-year-old son, the Earl, probably paying her dowry. This time, she married a future baron, Edward Carleton, who was 29, just like her. Also that very same month, the king's exiled cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, returned to England and attempted to take his duchy back from the king by force. The king was away in Ireland fighting, and Henry didn't really have to use force to take back his duchy. He had popular support. So then Henry decided he didn't just want the Duchy of Lancaster, he wanted England. And again, he had the support. The protector of the realm, the man who had been left in charge of England, was Joan's husband. Yes, our Joan. He was the uncle of both King Richard and Henry Bolingbroke. At first, he raised an army to fight against his nephew Henry, but seeing all the support Henry had, he promptly switched sides and supported his other nephew. They didn't pay him enough for this family drama. Joan's older brother Thomas, now 27, disagreed with this decision. He was Team Richard, and he joined up with other Team Richards and plotted to return Richard to the throne. He preferred Richard on the throne because Richard was still childless, and he was hoping that his nephew, Eleanor's 8-year-old, would still be Richard's choice for an heir. That could only happen if Richard was king again, and was more likely to happen if the 8-year-old's family helped him become king again. But they were outed to the new King Henry IV, and instead of showing up to his own kidnapping, he raised an army, and promptly arrested and executed Joan's brother and uncle, who had both been involved in the plot. Eleanor would have had reason to be worried. Her son was the closest thing to an heir that the deposed king had, and had an arguably better claim to the throne than the new King Henry. And her new husband was not yet a baron. He really didn't have much power to do much of anything against the king, so they were laying low and trying not to make any sudden movements. With Thomas executed and his next 2 brothers deceased, the next child was either Joan or Elizabeth. Joan was probably okay. Her husband had backed Richard too, but early on he had switched to his other nephew, King Henry. Elizabeth was still married to the son of an earl. Her father-in-law was probably a supporter of the old King Richard, but had pivoted in time to supporting the new King Henry, so they were probably safe as well. Joan's youngest brother inherited his brother's title, as his brother never had any children. He was 17 and unmarried, but for now, he was also an earl. Joan's younger sister Margaret, 15, was married to 27-year-old John Beaufort. The new King Henry had taken away some of John's titles, demoting him from a marquis to an earl. If you remember, marquis is mostly, at this point, a French job, but he was a marquis, which was slightly higher than an earl until he was demoted. But John was also the younger half-brother of the new King Henry, so as long as they were careful, they too were probably safe. Joan's sister Eleanor, with an E, was 13 and newly married to the 12-year-old future Earl Thomas Montague. Her father-in-law was involved in the same plot that her brother and uncle were, Epiphany Rising. He had been executed, and Eleanor's husband had been required to forfeit his titles, hoping that they were just on a break and he would get them back later. For now, it was dicey for them. It could really go either way. The Hollands were a Plantagenet family living in a newly Lancastrian world, and it was a tough adjustment. Lastly, Joan's probably youngest, sister, Bridget, was still a nun. Probably. #justice for Bridget the Forgotten. We don't know when she died, because no one wrote it down. If she was still alive, she was probably safe. She was a nun, and the new King Henry was Catholic, so she had a type of immunity. If you're keeping score, Joan has one brother left, who was an earl, but he also had a traitor brother and uncle, so he was sus. And she had 4 sisters who were in varying degrees of danger with the regime change. They were all laying low for the most part and hoping for the best. One sister had none immunity, and Joan herself was in the best position, being married to the old and new king's uncle, but seen as loyal to the new king. The Holland women were definitely faring better in the regime change than the Holland men, of whom there was only one left. Because of the Epiphany Rising plot, it was decided that Richard could not survive. But no one wanted to kill an anointed king, so instead, they starved him to death, arguing that if he starved to death, it wasn't murder. Sure, Jan. Just a couple of years later, 22-year-old Joan's 61-year-old husband died of natural causes in his birthplace. He was buried next to his first wife, Isabella, and his title passed to Joan's stepson, now 29. She was married 2 years later to Baron William Willoughby. He was 34 and had been married before. He had 5 children, all 19 and younger. William had pivoted from the old king to the new king fast enough to be seen as loyal by the new King Henry. William was only a baron, so he was on the lowest rung of the nobility ladder. But he was a loyal baron, and that meant something. The following year, Joan's oldest sister, Eleanor, died at the age of 35 in childbirth. Just 3 years after Eleanor died, her last brother Edmund, now 35 himself, died in battle. He had no legitimate heirs and only one illegitimate daughter. And so the earldom went extinct for now, but it will be back. The Holland family was shrinking rapidly, caught up in the Game of Thrones. In 1409, the family now consisted of Joan's mother Alice, now 59, who had never remarried. She had 4 or 5 daughters left, depending on if Bridget was still living. And we don't know. Elizabeth had her third son in 1410, so for the time being at least, she was still alive. And her sisters, Joan, 29, Margaret, 24, and Eleanor, 23. This was when Joan's second husband, William, died at the age of 39. He also was buried near his first wife, and his oldest son, Richard, inherited his title. Joan didn't waste much time and married for the 3rd time the next year. She was now 30, and he was 37. He'd been married once before, but he didn't have any children. His name was Henry Scope, and he was also a baron. We don't know exactly when Joan's sister Eleanor died, or of what, but sometime after 1413. Also in 1413, the not-so-new King Henry IV also died, at the age of 45. He had been sick for some time. Leprosy, maybe, although the symptoms don't really match. Leprosy might have just been a catch-all for some sort of skin disease. And his son, Henry, became King Henry V at the age of 27. The king is dead. Long live the king. You can view this transfer of power in the BBC's Hollow Crown, where Tom Hiddleston plays Henry V, or in Netflix's The King, where Timothée Chalamet plays Henry V. But with reign change comes uncertainty. But this reign change was relatively peaceful, and that brought hope. Joan's mother Alice was still alive, now 63. She had 2 living children, Joan, 33, and Margaret, 27. And maybe a 3rd, Bridget the Forgotten. We don't know. Margaret's first husband was now deceased, and she was married to Thomas, Duke of Clarence. He was the 26-year-old son of the old King Henry, and the brother to the new King Henry, so she probably felt relatively safe. She was now a royal duchess, just as her sister had been. Joan was still married to her 3rd husband, Henry Scope. Unfortunately for Joan, 2 years into young King Henry's reign and 5 years into her marriage, Henry was accused of being involved in the Southampton plot. The Southampton plot was a plot to remove King Henry V from the throne and replace him with Joan's nephew, Eleanor's oldest son, the now 24-year-old Edmund Mortimer. Contemporaries were surprised at his involvement, and it was possible that he was unsuccessfully playing both sides. Everyone was like, what, him? No, he's a loyal dude. But Henry was executed, and once again, Joan was single and in more danger than at any other time in her life. The following year, the now 36-year-old Joan married the possibly as young as 25 Sir Henry Bromfleet, a young knight who had worked in the household of King Henry IV and now worked in the household of his son, Henry V. Her plan seemed to be to blend in with the gentry. Noblemen were problematic. Joan's new husband was a knight and a soldier and a 3-time sheriff. He was very unlikely to cause any political problems or even get involved with any. Some kind of deployment or post change would likely have been their biggest worry. The same year, Joan married Sir Henry. Her mother also passed away at the age of 66. She was only survived by 2 of her 10 children, Joan and Margaret, but also a small army of grandchildren. Through her grandchildren, she had many successful descendants. Now is where we take a moment to mention some potentially recognizable names. Some of Alice's descendants include Kings Edward IV, V, and VI, Richard III, Henry VII and VIII, Mary, Queen of Scots, James, King of Scotland and England, and Queen Consorts of England, Anne Neville and Catherine Parr, along with many others. Joan herself passed away in 1434 at the age of 54. And that is where we will leave it for this week. What did you think about Joan, Margaret, and their family. They lived in a turbulent time and navigated it as well as they were able. Arguably, the Holland women fared better than the Holland men, but all in different ways. Joan married 4 times, and every time her husbands got younger and less politically powerful. Margaret went in the opposite direction, marrying first an earl and then a royal duke. And Bridget went in a completely third direction, becoming a nun. Likely, these women had very little choice in the direction of their lives, but they survived 3 kings, numerous rebellions, and a host of plots by noblemen, a lot of whom they were related to. You can share your thoughts with me at longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com or on Facebook or Instagram at longlivethequeenpodcast. Long live to all the queens out there. And until next week, bye.